And we're live. I'm from Nashville, Tennessee, and in 2011 there was a huge flood in the city that the whole Cumberland River flooded, and I remember so specifically the Barnes and Noble flooding and the images of all of those books that were water damaged. So thankfully our flood was not that bad.
How long have you worked there, Lainey?
I have been at the store since 2020. I joined in the pandemic because I originally worked in theater and theater was not happening.
No.
Yeah. So it's been a good bunch of community support has come in. There's been a lot of people reaching out to help and offering their time and their boxes. So we're very grateful for everyone's help.
Excellent. Well, we'll try to remember to put in a plug to support East City.
We appreciate it. Okay, and I will go ahead and get started on our intro. So, hello and welcome everyone. My name is Lainey Rose. I'm the events manager here at East City Bookshop. We are a woman-owned, community-focused independent bookstore located in the heart of Washington, D.C., just a few blocks away from the Capitol building and from the Library of Congress. It's wonderful to be with you all today virtually, and we appreciate your patience and your flexibility as our staff are working hard to put our store back together. As many of you know, our store suffered some significant water damage in the last couple of weeks and have been closed since then. If you'd like to support the store, you can shop on our bookshop.org storefront, donate to our Ko-Fi, and continue to sign up for our events. We are hoping, fingers crossed, knock on wood, to be back open again for the latter half of August. So keep an eye on our social media and our website for more information. But we are so grateful for all of the community support and well wishes we have gotten. We will have time for questions tonight, so please put your questions in the Q&A feature on Zoom, and then put your general thoughts and enthusiasm into the chat feature. Tell us where you're tuning in from. We'd love to know. And most importantly, if you need to get your hands on a copy of The Rent Collectors, you can purchase a copy on our website. Those books were not affected by the floods, so we'd be happy to put them into your hands. And now the reason we're here this evening, The Rent Collectors, Exploitation, Murder, and Redemption in Immigrant LA. Despite the fact that we are on the opposite coast from LA, we knew that this was a book our audiences would want to get their hands on and our staff were enthusiastic about. Kirkus Reviews called this book a masterful work of true crime and, to be sure, true punishment. With The Rent Collectors, Jesse Katz has built a teeth-clenching and breathless narrative that explicates the difficult and proud lives of undocumented Black market workers who are being extorted by the gangs and fined by the city of LA. In other words, exploited by two sets of rent collectors. Our author of the evening is Jesse Katz, who spent 15 years at the Los Angeles Times and another 9 years at Los Angeles Magazine. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the New York Magazine, Rolling Stone, GQ, the American Prospect, Pacific Standard, California Sunday Magazine, and in the anthologies Best American Writing Magazine, Best American Crime Writing, and Best American Sports Writing. He teaches at the University of California, Irvine, and has volunteered at both Central Juvenile Hall and the Hyman G. Stark Youth Correctional Facility. He lives in Los Angeles. Joining him in conversation tonight is Rueben Castaneda, who works for the American University Alumni Magazine. He's the author of Street Rising, Crack, Murder, and Redemption in D.C., which the Washington Post put on its list of 50 notable works of nonfiction in 2014. Castaneda works as a reporter for 22 years at the Washington Post, where he primarily covered crime, court, and police misconduct. And now I've talked enough, so I will let these two take it away.
Thank you very much. Jesse, this is a great book, remarkable in terms of research, reporting, and writing. Let's get right to it. The main character is Giovani, an immigrant who falls into a gang because he has a terrible home life and ends up committing a terrible, awful crime. I'm interested to know, how did you come to meet Giovanni and persuade him to tell his story?
Well, it's great to be with you, Ruben. And if you'll indulge me for a moment, I just want to thank East City Bookshop and wish them well. Our brick and mortar bookstores are fragile institutions, even in the best of times. And an unfortunate leak is just a real bummer. And we're wishing you a speedy uh, reopening. And Ruben, to be with you is also a real honor. Your book, S Street Rising, delves deep into the streets of Washington, but you also know the streets of LA from your time at the Herald Examiner. So you also unite our two coasts here. To answer your question, I was living in the MacArthur Park area. Uh, I moved in there around 2011, so it wasn't quite as the Wild West that you knew from the 1980s when you were out here. But it was still like it's a really challenging community, a very complex, precarious place. I think whatever people's image of LA might be, it's probably off because even people who live in LA have a distorted image of what LA looks like. But if you can picture a beautiful park with a lake at the center, fish, birds, waterfowl, like a real place to feel free in some ways, but surrounded by incredibly dense housing, century-old tenements, tens of thousands of immigrants living in just incredibly overcrowded, uncomfortable conditions. Really, LA at its most precarious. And what I discovered was that about 6 blocks from my front door, this terrible crime had been committed a few years earlier. I wasn't there in 2007 when the shooting happened, but the trials were playing out shortly after I moved in. And so I had a chance to learn a little bit about Giovani's story and or at least his crime and the consequences, but I didn't know much about him as a person or the world he'd grown up in. And it took me a few years to work up the courage because I don't know, he'd been in prison for a number of years by then, and who knows if what happens to somebody who's been in prison for a while. It could go one of two ways. And I thought, well, there's a chance that he has been hardened or broken in some fundamental way and is just not going to want to talk about anything. But then I want to believe that maybe he'd been transformed by that experience and wasn't the same person that he'd been. And so I wrote him a letter. I looked him up on the California inmate locator, and I didn't have an introduction or a go between. I just wrote him a letter out of the blue. You don't know me, I don't know you, but I don't think you should be defined by the worst thing you ever did. None of us are the sum total of our mistakes. And if you are willing to share some of your thoughts and memories, I have an open mind. And as it turned out, my need to know about Giovani was matched by his need to share his story. He was in his 11th year of incarceration at the time and had been kind of forgotten in a lot of ways. He was very much one of those kids that was locked up and the key was thrown away. And he just really didn't have much support in his life. And so to kind of parachute into his world, he, I think, welcomed that.
Did you you started out writing him and he wrote back, it was positive? Did there come a time when you had a meeting with him at the prison where he was locked up? And did you develop, once you realized what this could be, did you develop a routine of meeting him?
Yeah, so not long after I wrote him, he wrote me back, and honestly, when I opened his letter, I felt kind of like at that moment that my life had changed fundamentally forever. He was uh, telling me that his life was an open book. If it could open some other young person's eyes and help them avoid the mistakes that he'd made. And I will say that, well, within a month, I was visiting him in prison. And it was a routine that I kept up. I still keep up to this day. I see him roughly once a month. We also write letters and do phone calls. And the last year or so, He's been issued a tablet by the prison system so we can text each other. Communications have gotten better, but I always felt that seeing him in person was the way to build a bond. And it's a curious experience because there are no special accommodations made for journalists or authors. I go on visiting day just like anyone else visiting their loved one. I sort of stand out in the visiting room. There's a lot of very dolled up women there to see their men, and I'm sort of the white guy wearing REI hiking pants. But we sit there, and I can bring in up to $50 in singles and quarters for the vending machines. We get a bunch of very sugary and fatty foods and have this kind of smorgasbord of ultra processed snacks. And, we talk for 2, 3, 4 hours. I don't have any recording equipment when I go to see him. I'm not allowed to bring that in, not even pen and paper. So the conversations are very kind of intense in a way, very present. I'm not distracted by any tools of the trade, if you will. But it's also a challenge, and I have to try to remember everything he tells me. And then when I'm done, I rush back to my car and jot it all down in one big torrent. As a bit of a backup, I've always written him a letter after our visits, and it's a way of thanking him for his time and telling him what really stood out to me. Your comment about A, B, or C was very moving, very poignant, and it reminded me of this, that, or the other thing, and that's kind of a way of memorializing the conversation and giving him a chance to respond or maybe revise my memory of the conversation.
I like hearing stories like that. To me, that's very old school, basic shoe leather reporting. There's no cell phone, there's no recording device, not even notebook and pen. So that warms my heart. Uh, were there ever any points in time where Giovani seemed to be drawing away from you, or asked you to do anything that you felt was maybe out of bounds?
Uh, Quite the contrary. He at every step of this process, and now we've been together for 6 years. I wrote to him in 2018. Um, he has always chosen truth over secrets. He has never once asked me to omit something or to change a name or to sugarcoat anything. I think he really believes that just the unvarnished truth of what he's been through, what he's endured, what he did, and also who he's trying to become is his path to healing. And maybe that opportunity to return to society is a better version of himself. I'll tell you, he never has once asked me, well, in the early going, before the book came out, he never asked me when the book's going to be done. I almost felt like he didn't want it to be over. So I felt in my gut, he never said this, but that maybe he worried that once the project was done, I might be done with him. And so I always reassured him that we're building a bond that's going to transcend the needs of the story. And I feel that even deeper today, we are really bound together in a very profound sense. And he's got a very special place in my life. He sometimes gets teased by other incarcerated people asking him, well, how much are you making on this deal? And he tells them, well, he's not making anything, I'll tell you that. He tells them it's not about money, it's about being blessed. And that just sounds so incredibly earnest. It sounds like not something that somebody in kind of a hardened prison world is going to say, but that's the way he talks, it's the way he thinks, and I think that's an authentic expression of what he's feeling right now.
It's very very clear from the narrative that he opened up completely and that he did not hold anything back. Another key character in the book is his mother. You call her Reina, as not her real name, which I think was, I think you mentioned that she deserves some grace because of just the terribly difficult life that she has led. What was it like meeting her the first time? And was she difficult to persuade to open up?
Yeah, so she is the one pseudonym I use in the book. There's quite a cast of characters. We even have an org chart in the early pages to help guide the reader as the names begin to pile up. Um, but they're all real names. But she's been through very tough times in her life, and there's sensitive information, there's sensitive medical information, and it just seemed like she deserved a little bit of protection and privacy here. Um, and she was not eager to open up, but we also spent a lot of time together. We had meals together and coffee together, and eventually we would do visits together to the prison. And her story, so this is a true crime book. It's called True Crime, and that's accurate in the sense that it's all true, and there's a terrible crime at the center of it. And I think we'll get to that in a moment. But it's also about all the other layers of that ecosystem that led up to that tragic moment. These global forces, policy choices, systemic failures, family breakdowns, all the stuff that gives you the why of the incident. And the story kind of starts with her being a little girl in El Salvador on the eve of the Civil War. One of the neighbors, actually a young man living under the same roof as her family was gunned down by the National Police on a college campus. And a week or two later, Archbishop Romero was assassinated by a death squad. And suddenly the country is just really plunged into turmoil. And she is sent north to reunite with her parents who had left some years earlier. And, they had hoped that they would have found a secure toehold in the US to bring her up, but they hadn't. They had been working very marginal lives, mostly cleaning office buildings at night. And so they had to use a coyote to bring her north. And, Giovanni's mom was placed in the trunk of a car and driven across the border at age 8 or 9. And I don't know, it's just like maybe it's a small detail in a much larger narrative, but I just think of this little girl being told to get in a trunk that hadn't been, outfitted with any light or fresh air or anything to, accommodate somebody being back there, and being told to keep her mouth shut and to not cry until somebody opened the trunk again. And that just seems like a really deep, deep trauma. Some people get over that and are resilient. I think in her case, it really was the beginning of some real fractures in her life.
Um, you mentioned the crime. Talk about this crime and the dramatic reaction that it created in Los Angeles.
Yeah, so in this part of LA, MacArthur Park, which for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's about a mile, maybe a mile and a half west of downtown. So you have the gleaming skyscrapers, and then you have this sort of modern day Ellis Island. It's looks a lot like probably New York City, Lower East Side did in the early part of the 1900s. And there are many, many immigrants, largely undocumented, who have come to this country to work, and yet they're barred from the formal workforce. So they have to figure out some way to survive. They need to put bread on the table and kind of invent their own livelihood. And many of them have turned to street vending. They're making tamales at home and bringing them out to the curb to sell, or they're buying batteries or diapers in bulk and then selling them piecemeal to make some extra money. And for years and years, decades and decades, really, until recently, the city of LA criminalized street vending. And what they were really doing was criminalizing poverty. So people who were doing ostensibly legal work, or at least exhibiting some degree of self-sufficiency, were suddenly targets for the LAPD. And they were being harassed, they were being cited, fined, arrested, and being, sucked into the criminal justice system with all those humiliations and sort of cycle of poverty and immigration consequences. And at the same time, you had a really nefarious hierarchical gang, a little different from your average, disorganized street gang. And they saw the vulnerability of those street vendors, and they started taxing the vendors, charging rent to be out on a public sidewalk. And, it wasn't a ton of money. It was 10, $20 at first, and then 30, $40. And they were just really exploiting the vulnerability of the vendors, who were kind of hung out to dry by the city too. They were really caught between these, as Lainey Rose said, two sets of rent collectors. And what happens is one street vendor named Francisco Clemente, very proud and stubborn man, and I think if he had to do it all over again, he'd probably do it differently. But he stood up to the gang and he refused to pay them. And I just think of that moment where he defied them. He was not celebrated. He didn't have anyone backing him up or cheering him on, just like one lonely man on a street corner in Los Angeles telling the gang to back off, that he's just a man trying to earn a living. And I just think of like the courage that went into that. And maybe the short-sightedness, because he was taking on a really violent organization. And they couldn't allow that to stand. They needed to send Francisco a message, as well as all the other hundreds and thousands of vendors who are out on the streets doing the same thing, that you got to pay. And so what do? There's these older, savvier gang members who are calling the shots. They don't want to do the dirty work themselves, so they find a kid, the weak link, naive, needy, um, desperate to belong. That's Giovani. And he had just turned 18. And he described it at the time when this was all happening, that he was hungry for respect. But the more I've gotten to know him, it's pretty clear to me that what he wanted was love. And this gang, in a lot of ways, was a more stable social institution than his own family at home. And they put a gun in his hand and marched him down the street and told him that's the vendor. He was not involved in this extortion racket. He had never seen the vendor. He didn't know who he was supposed to shoot. But at that moment, given like some very terrible options, he made the least crappy choice he could come up with. And that was to follow through on this, basically this dare, almost a suicide mission. And he shoots the vendor, and thankfully, Francisco survived. He's still a fragile man. He has two of Giovanni's bullets still lodged in his flesh and bone. And, it's very emotional for him to talk about this. But the real deep, tragedy here is that one of the bullets struck a newborn baby. There was an infant that was 23 days old, a little boy, who was swaddled in a stroller next to Francisco. And that bullet killed the baby. His name's Luis Angel. And you ask yourself, why was even a newborn out on the street on a Saturday night amid all this commotion? Well, the baby's mother was a vendor herself, who didn't have childcare, who didn't have health insurance, who really didn't have any kind of safety net. She needed to make money to feed her baby. And you and I can talk about how terrible this kind of crime is. But we know that in the world of gangs, where all sorts of mayhem is permitted, killing a baby is a bridge too far. This is a special kind of atrocity. It's almost treated like a war crime. And so from the highest levels of the prison gang world, uh, the layer above the street gang, they are sending word that the only way that this gang can avoid becoming a target now, where it's open season on this gang because of this shameful act, is to get rid of Giovani. They call it a green light. There's a green light on the neighborhood. And Giovani, who's so naive and so desperate to believe that he's done something that will endear him to these older male figures in this world, um, is lured down to Mexico, thinking that they're going to hide him out. He's going to lay low until the heat dies down and he can return to LA. But what they really did is they were shepherding him to his execution. And in the middle of the night, um, they take him out on this windy mountain road between Tijuana and Mexicali called La Rumorosa. And it's like this Martian landscape, very cinematic rock formations. And they put a rope around his neck, and his own homies, two of them, yank, strangling him until they hear something snap, and they heave him off the edge of this cliff into this gorge below. And they returned to LA saying, we took care of this. They called it cleaning up their yard or taking out the trash, and back to business as usual. And the incredible thing is that Giovani wakes up on the side of this cliff, and his neck is a mess, but he's otherwise okay. He's alive, and he's now got to figure out what to do. And he crawls out and gets to the road, and I'm just obsessed with that moment. Like, you've done the worst thing imaginable. The people you did it for have betrayed and disposed of you. And now this kid needs to figure out what to do with his life, who he is. How does one ever recover from this thing? How can he live with himself? What next? And it's just such a fascinating and horrible question.
Those scenes are incredibly dramatic. They're in a couple different sections of the book where you describe the, I guess you could call it assassination attempt on Giovani, where his own homies do try to kill him. And it's really miraculous that he somehow survived. It's clear from the book that you also spoke to some 18th Street gang members, maybe not all of them, but you did get at least a couple of them to open up and talk. What was that like?
There were some people that I couldn't access. Some of them are in witness protection programs. I can't even find them. Uh, but there was one guy named Baby. He was the architect of the vendor tax. He actually thought it was a good idea, like smart business, to begin extorting the vendors. Um, and he did some time, you know, because he cooperated with the federal government. But I was able to track him down, and I wrote him a letter. I wrote a lot of letters to people. It was amazing how nobody gets mail anymore. So you write somebody's address and put a stamp on an envelope, and they're like, "Wow, they got mail." And a baby calls me up as soon as he gets my letter, and he says to me, he's trying to figure out, who I am, what this is about. And he says, if I don't talk to you, am I going to be in your book anyway? And like, damn, that's a smart question. And the cold truth of it is that, well, yeah, you are going to be in my book because um, you testified in open court. So I have your name, and I have your testimony. And but I don't want you to appear like just as a witness or just as a defendant. I want to present you as a human being. I want to know your story, your family life, your background. And he appreciated that. And so I went out to see him, and we got to know each other face to face. And we've now been out a number of times, drinking some beers, shooting some pool, um, really seeing each other as, uh, you know, in a man to man kind of way. I will say that one of the reasons that I care about this story, and I think people care about sort of true crime tales, is it's like twofold, right? Like on one hand, we want to know how that world works. We want to know the mechanics of the organization. But we also find that when we get to know people as individuals and see them, as humans with a name and a face and a backstory, we start to feel a little differently about them. You're not far from the setting of The Wire. I love The Wire. Bad things happen in The Wire, but why do we watch The Wire? Because we begin to identify with some of the characters, even the characters doing negative things, right? We admire Omar or Stringer Bell or whoever because we're maybe not admire, but we feel something for them. We feel an empathy for their situation because we've gotten to know them. And I was able to have that relationship with people like Baby. I certainly had that relationship with Giovani. It was really important to me that people not be types or categories, but three-dimensional human beings.
Yes, I think that this book does a great job portraying um, every character in a three-dimensional manner. I think that one of the I like true crime books as much as anybody, but I think too many of them lean heavily into the perspective of the law enforcement characters, and perhaps because the other characters in their narratives weren't available or wouldn't talk, but you put in the work and you got Giovanni's perspective as well as Reina's, so many Francisco. I think this is a very full-blooded account of not just this crime and its aftermath, but of what life was like. Um, I think probably to a large extent is like for immigrants in and near MacArthur Park who are often overlooked or not thought of. And personally, for me, it also I also learned that this is the gang I was probably putting money in their pockets. For those unaware, S Street Rising, my memoir, recounts how I was using crack cocaine in the late '80s through the early '90s. Um, when I moved to DC to work for the Washington Post. And I made a number of buys in MacArthur Park. And these were quick exchanges. And now I know who was getting those funds. I was helping support the little psychos. So
You were close to the action, man. You covered this as a reporter, but you also, and lived it from the inside. And I know went through quite a journey of recovery. And I'm so glad you're with us here today.
well, it was thank you. It was just for me, it was just tremendously it was just fast. It was fascinating. I think it's fast. This would be fascinating for any reader. For me, this it had the added dimension of trying to figure out, as you described, action occurring on streets near MacArthur Park and in buildings. Was I in that building? Did I make a buy there? So I think it's a tremendous read. I want to remind those who are on who are watching that anybody who wants to is welcome to ask questions in the Q&A. Jesse and I can keep talking if people are shy. The law enforcement people, there are also law enforcement officers who are part of this. Oh, well, we'll circle back to that. What are you working on next?
Boy, I'm, the no rest for the weary. This was a multiple year project, and just trying to get it out there into the world. But I appreciate you asking. I've been trying to develop a first person essay about my relationship with Giovanni. It's a little bit of an excerpt from the book, but it also tells that story about how we got to know each other, and ultimately what we came to mean in each other's lives. Um, he calls me Tio these days, and so I'm Uncle Jesse, and he I don't know how to say this. My son, who's in his early 30s, is very close in age to Giovanni, and he's had all sorts of advantages. Privileges, education, all the mini lotteries that we win when our lives seem to be on the right track. And Giovanni didn't win those lotteries. He missed out on a lot of things, and so he kind of needs me in ways that my son doesn't need me as much these days. And it's sort of nice to be needed. It's nice to feel that my support for Giovanni, my encouragement, um, might actually be making a difference in his life. Can I respond to the question about law enforcement? Because
Sure.
uh,
And then we've got another question.
okay, there were uh, although I'm really proud of the fact that the book centers the experiences and voices of people who often aren't heard from, or only or maybe only heard from as kind of secondary characters, but to give them the spotlight, to give the Giovannis of the world the spotlight, or the Franciscos of the world the spotlight, and really the Reinas, to make their lives the central part of the story, was really my goal. And I hesitated to tell too much of that through the prism or the lens of law enforcement. But there were a couple great law enforcement characters. One in particular is a LAPD homicide detective named David Holmes, who looks like central casting's idea of a homicide detective. And his job is to solve this murder. And he eventually takes Giovanni into custody and elicits a confession from him. But he becomes the protector and advocate for Francisco and Francisco's partner, Jessica. And they are the witnesses that are going to have to testify in multiple trials. And he sees that the burden of being an undocumented immigrant going into a courthouse and taking the witness stand is really weighing on them and causing them a lot of anxiety. And he has his own kind of transformation here, his own awakening, where he had always looked at street vendors from a cop point of view and thought of them as a public nuisance, as, just a problem that needed to be dealt with. And suddenly he's seeing them again as human beings. He sees Francisco as a proud man, hardworking, trying to take care of his family. And he says to himself, if anyone's going to be in this country, I want Francisco here. And it's not what you really expect to hear from, an otherwise, hard-boiled LAPD detective. And he then takes it upon himself to fix Francisco's and Jessica's papers. He gets them a U visa, which is available to people who are victims of violent crime but cooperate with the authorities. And then he gets them their green cards. And it's a years long process navigating, like, an impenetrable bureaucracy, all sorts of paperwork that has to be submitted. Other cops in his life were looking at him like he was nuts. Like, why would you do that for these people? But he saw their humanity. And I just love that he started in one place and ended in another as a result of this investigation.
Um, a question from one of our participants. Are there any other pieces of true crime writing or nonfiction about LA that you'd recommend reading next?
Boy. Well, I'm a huge admirer of Hector Tobar. He's a friend of mine. but we were also colleagues at the LA Times going back decades. His very first book is called The Tattooed Soldier, and it is about immigrants living in the MacArthur Park area. It's the MacArthur Park of the 1990s. It's actually set against the uprising of 1992 here in Los Angeles. And it's this kind of chance meeting with a former death squad soldier and the widower of one of his victims, and like they settle these scores from far away on the streets of MacArthur Park, and I just think it's one of the great LA books. Um, what else? I was just talking a moment ago about the library book. This is not quite true crime, but maybe it's relevant to East City Bookshop. Susan Orlean, the New Yorker writer, wrote a book about this terrible fire at the Central Library in Los Angeles. It occurred in 1986. It's actually the worst fire ever in a US library, and it damaged hundreds of thousands of books. And she tells it like a whodunit, trying to solve the crime. And it's kind of a fire forensic procedural, but it's also a meditation on the role that libraries play in our communities and what books mean to us all. So I'm a huge fan of that as well.
Those are good recommendations. Another participant asks, what has been the feedback or response since the book's publication? I know you've gotten some great reviews. I'd also be interested in knowing any response from some of the characters, people in the book.
Yes, I went into this a little nervous about how some of those people would respond, especially Giovani's family. Um, it shines, such a bright light on such difficult life experiences. And also from Giovani, he's very exposed in this book. His life is just laid out there bare. Um, he is in the process of reading it. I should say there are so many obstacles in prison to anyone wanting to improve their lives. There's just one barrier and pitfall after another. The book exists only in hardcover right now. I can't send a hardcover to prison. The authorities think that the cover will be used for a weapon. They actually peel off the fiber and wet it and twist it and turn it into some kind of a shank. It's not available in paperback yet. So what I've done is print it out as a Word document. But then the other obstacle is I can only put 10 sheets of paper, no more than 10 sheets of paper in an envelope at a time. So I've now sent Giovani like 30 envelopes, every couple of days. And I can only imagine how weird it is to be getting this serialized version of his life. He's read most of it. There's a couple envelopes that have gotten lost in the shuffle that I have to resend. But I would say for him, who he is the reader I care the most about, because he's in such a difficult place and in a vulnerable situation. For Giovani, the book has kind of given him his life story in ways that he didn't know it before. His childhood had been fractured by so many difficulties, by substance abuse and domestic violence and secrets about who his parents were. And I think he when I first started interviewing him, there were just questions he couldn't even answer for me because he didn't really know the truth. It was all this kind of a murky experience. And so my curiosity, my going and digging into his life and his family background and interviewing his relatives, which meant traveling to Mexico, traveling to El Salvador, traveling to Guatemala, to interview and really understand the various journeys that his parents took to the U.S. gave him insight into who he was that he didn't have before. So he views the book as a clarifying experience. And yes, there's parts in it that he reads that are really hard for him. He's told me to read about Francisco's injuries and the medical intervention and surgeries he went through, to read about this infant and knowing that he was the cause of that is really hard for him. But he also feels like he needs to do it. Like he has to do it. He has to face that. And I just admire his courage and integrity and what it takes to be willing to bear those burdens.
Is another participant asked, is the book or will the book be available in Spanish?
Hmm, excellent question. I sure hope so. My publisher, Astra House, is really devoted to championing underrepresented voices and experiences. And I think they saw this book not just as a piece of LA noir in the true crimey aspects, but that larger global journey that connects us across the Americas. And it would be fantastic if it were in Spanish. It might be a challenge with some of the slang or some of the Spanglish to reverse engineer it. I should say too that there is a fair amount of untranslated Spanish in the book, and I'm proud of two things, and I'm grateful to Astra House for allowing this. One is the Spanish words are not italicized. They just appear in regular type like any other word. And that seems maybe like a small, subtle thing, but it was important to me that this is the way people talk. And we don't need to exoticize those words to make them seem like there's something different or, external to our lives. Certainly the way people talk in Los Angeles. And then there were, I don't know, 10, 12 people in the book who I interviewed exclusively in Spanish. And of course, their words are largely translated in the primary text, but in my endnotes, I've included the complete transcript of what they said in Spanish. So I felt like it was a way of like dignifying their response to me and not just passing it through, my interpretation of what they said.
Another participant asks, have you done any reporting this personal before?
Well, in a way, but it was aimed at me, not at others. I wrote a book 15 years ago called The Opposite Field, and it's a memoir. It's about largely my life with my son in the immigrant suburbs of LA and the community of Monterey Park. And I was his baseball coach. And later, as our league was dissolving, I volunteered to become the commissioner of our league, which put me in contact with all sorts of adult drama, some of which I participated in. And it was a very, I kind of laid myself bare. It's a very intimate look at who I was at that period in my life. Um, so yes, personal, but this was, I didn't want to be in the rent collectors. It wasn't about me. It wasn't about my voice or my experience. I didn't want to compete with those characters. Um, and I would say too, for years and years, I was a newspaper writer and then a magazine writer. I still do some magazine writing, but to write a book where you're able to really explore ideas at great length and detail and put more of yourself into it. So I'm not in there as a character, but my emotion is in there, my conscience, my conscientiousness is in there, I hope, on every page. And so in that sense, it's very personal to me, but it's really about the lives of other people.
Another participant asks, how did you, and I think you achieved this, how do you go about portraying Giovani and his mother, etc., as fully realized people and avoid leaning into a type?
Mm, man, these are all good questions from the East City crowd. Um, to me, it's a lot of it is just being specific, asking the questions that lead to concrete answers. Um, I One of the things I did with Giovanni was also I'd give him these kind of like homework assignments where I'd say, write me a letter about the ways you were disciplined as a kid. And out comes this story of his stepfather pouring rice, uncooked rice on the floor and making Giovanni wear short pants and kneel on that rice until it just felt that each grain was burrowing into his skin. Like that's so vivid and so visual, and that's not just having a cruel stepfather or old country discipline or something, and very specific. Or I would ask him, tell me when you were being strangled, what do you remember from that moment? um, Try to put yourself in that frame of mind. And he wrote me, an extraordinary letter about how he felt himself dying, how he felt himself going to hell for the wrong that he'd done. And, it's just like very personal and very just not generic kind of uh, recollections. And I should say too, when I would get these letters from Giovanni, these extraordinary tales from his life, I would make copies of them for myself just to have, but then I would send the originals back to him so he could be building his own archive of his life and his own sort of assemble his own narrative.
Speaking of his narrative, at some point, he will have an opportunity to seek parole or early release. Um, do you think that his portrayal in this book, which shows a real arc, real growth, a real taking of responsibility, in my view, do you think that this might help him as he seeks release at some point?
That's a really good question. I should add that he's serving a 51-year sentence. He ended up cooperating with the government and testified in a couple of trials, and in exchange, he had already confessed, so he didn't have much leverage. And 51 years, when you're 18 years old, sounds like forever. But he's also been the beneficiary of a really dramatic rethinking of crime and punishment here in California. I think it's happening in other places too, where there's more of a philosophy of second chances and less of that punitive three strikes you're out mentality. And about 10 years ago, the California legislature passed a new law that acknowledges that youthful offenders are not as culpable as they would be if they were fully grown. And it's based on a lot of brain science that under the age of 23 or so, the parts of your brain that evaluate risk and reward and are susceptible to peer pressure and whatnot just haven't developed, and that those people are owed um, a better chance at rehabilitation. And so Giovanni suddenly, in year, I don't know, 10 of his incarceration, learned that in year 15, he would get his first appearance before the parole board as a youthful offender. The board would need to take all those things into consideration in evaluating whether he should be released. Without giving too much away at the end of the book, I can say that Giovani will have that review next spring in May of 2025. And it'll be interesting. I really don't know how the book will play. There's a part of me that worries that maybe a cynical parole board commissioner could kind of throw it in his face saying, you were out there trying to become, I don't know, famous or profit off of your crime in some way or gain notoriety, none of which is true, but could that be held against him? But what I want to believe is that, as you said, Ruben, that they will see in the book, in the narrative itself, somebody who is undergoing a transformation, somebody who's not the same person today who he was when he pulled the trigger in 2007. He's literally grown up. He's a 35-year-old man now, and you grow out of some of those I don't know, criminal hijinks that you might be involved in when you're a teenager, and we all do stupid stuff when we're a teenager. So I think even beyond that, by exploring his backstory, by shedding light on his family, on the difficulties that his mom went through, and troubles with his biological father and stepfather, I think he's going to be better equipped today to tell his own story. He's going to be able to stand in front of that parole board and explain better what went wrong in his life and who he is today. And I think he couldn't do that as well when I first met him.
I think we're getting close to the time to wrap up. But one thing that I'm very curious about is what is MacArthur Park and what are the surrounding streets like today?
So they're not as gnarly as they were when you were out there copping whatever you needed to. I think much like S Street in DC, which I understand has gone through quite a bit of a transformation and is not like it was during the battle days. MacArthur Park is experiencing sort of the first indications of gentrification. There's incredible pressure on housing in LA, and you can begin to see people living in the community that probably wouldn't have lived there 10 or 20 years ago. And on one hand, that's good. It adds some stability and some economic investment to the community. But as always, there's the question of, well, the poor people who needed this community to stay afloat, for whom this was their toehold, where are they going to go and how are they going to make it?
It's happened in many neighborhoods across the country. Lainey is back with us.
I am back with you, and I hate to cut you off because this has been just such an interesting and moving conversation. I really appreciate both of your time getting to share the story with us and getting to talk about the process of getting the story. I mean, I am just so moved by it, and I can't wait to put this book in the hands of all of our customers who come looking for it. So thank you both so much for your time tonight. Thank you both for our attendees. Thank you all for being here and for being flexible with us as we're drowning a little bit, but on our swing back up. So thank you all for being here. You can shop the book at our store. Like I said, these books were not damaged and they're sitting at my desk. So I'd be happy to pack them up and send them out to you. So thank you all tonight. And it's been so wonderful spending the evening with you.
Great. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.